Hi, folks. This is Brandon Gallagher, and welcome to Safety Meeting. I'm here with Jenna Cardenas, and this podcast, we're going to dive into the facts and into the differences between ceramic and quartz. Jenna, talk about our process of, going through this research over the last couple of years, and how we've come to get these facts. Tell us what the experiments look like that we've done, and the testing has done.
Yeah. So the lab that we picked in Europe is met with a very high standard. The lab followed FDA testing protocols. They're ISO certified. They specialize in vapor analysis, and they specially curated our experiment to fit the needs that we were looking for. They used a set of 2 impingers, which was new to them, and they developed this new method, but it was to make sure that they captured all of the vapor so they could quantitatively tell us what was in it. A lot of people complain about the vapor taste. That's one of the biggest complaints in the vaping industry, is the burnt aftertaste associated with cartridges, especially towards the end of its life. This is why we wanted the sample to be collected at the beginning, middle, and end of the cartridge's life cycle, so we can better understand what's happening to the vapor as you progress through the cartridge. According to ISO standards, a puff is composed of a 3-second inhalation period, followed by at least 15 seconds of pause in between the puffs. In our experiment, 10 puffs were taken in triplicate at the beginning, middle, and end of the cartridge's life cycle to ensure accurate results. We also did a duplicate run with another cartridge for each stage. This means 2 ceramic and 2 quartz cartridges. They took 30 puffs at each of the 3 different stages, totaling 90 puffs per cartridge. To collect the silica particles, they ran the samples through 2 impingers and used a high-accuracy liquid particle counter to assess particle size and distribution in order to make comparisons between the heating elements' performance. For degradation products, the lab analyzed the vapor for the top 27 most common harmful or potentially harmful constituents. They're also known as HPHCs, associated with the vaping devices. And this study will be focusing on the top 5 most reported HPHCs that were found in the vapor.
Thank you, Jenna. I want to reiterate that I know this seems like, since we are a vaporizer company, Vuber Technologies is a vaporizer company, that this could be seen as biased. But we are doing this for consumer knowledge, to educate the consumers. They can choose from there. We feel like there isn't enough education out there. There's not enough funding, not even close. There's barely research papers being released, a couple maybe on e-liquids or e-juice, or when it comes to the stuff we're diving into, there's really not much material there. Jenna, what are degradant products? Can you explain that more?
Yeah, so in our case, degradant products are going to be what we refer to as HPHCs. Degradant products are formed when a molecule chemically breaks down from one molecule into something new. In our study, HPHCs are the unwanted degradant products formed by cannabinoids or terpenes during the vaporization process. And you might be wondering what causes degradation to happen. Well, there are many factors that can cause a molecule to react or degrade, but looking at our study specifically, there are a few key factors that go into play. When chemicals are exposed to extreme temperatures, it excites the molecules, making it more reactive with both itself and the environment around it. There's also ceramic's ability to act as a catalyst. A catalyst is a component in a reaction that isn't directly involved, but causes a reaction to speed or slow down. Rust is a pretty typical example of a catalytic process. We see iron left in a dry environment. It'll retain its shiny luster. But when catalyst is exposed, an oxidation reaction occurs, causing iron to turn into iron 3 oxide, also known as rust. A team of scientists from the University of Kentucky who were studying ceramics said that, quote, ceramic materials have unlimited potential as catalytic materials for use in a diversity of reactor configurations and over a range of operating. Their published paper says that one of the biggest factors of ceramic catalytic efficiency is the amount of surface area exposed to potential reactants. Now, considering the ceramic heating element is exposed to extreme temperatures and the surface area is ample due to its amorphous, porous structure, it is highly probable that it acts as a catalyst in the degradation of cannabinoids or terpenes. More research is needed to determine the exact mechanisms of degradation. However, we do know from other research that degradation is happening. Our study confirmed that a factor in the amount of degradation is dependent on the hardware that's used.
So in essence, whether it's terpenes in your cartridge, whether it's, the different cannabinoids in your THC oil, or in this case, the material of the element, whether it's a ceramic, cotton, silica is the older way, and they still use it in e-cigs, or are the quartz, the chemical reaction, what happens after is dependent on those variables. So how do the terpenes and the cannabis oils and the different cannabinoids interact with the heating element, and what's the difference between ceramic and quartz exactly when it comes to that?
Yeah, so if we look at the structure of cannabinoids, especially terpenes, we see that they're very fragile molecules. Terpenes will start to degrade under the most minimal conditions. Basic lighting will start to degrade terpenes. So when you start introducing things like extreme heat, which is what we need to vaporize, that in itself is a factor that will make chemicals react with each other. Then we add the hardware, and the hardware is like the environment that the cannabinoids are sitting in. In this case, we're looking at quartz and ceramic, and we see that ceramic has evidence of being a catalyst, a variety of different reactions. So there's evidence that it already is happening. We just see that in this case, it could also be a potential factor, especially with the extreme heat. Reactions that wouldn't normally take place in this type of environment will take place because of the heat. And so adding two factors of conditions here, the heat and the catalytic properties, it just seems very likely that the degradation is happening due to the hardware and the heat. But the hardware is really what's making a huge difference here, and we can see that in the results. The 129% more degradant products were collected for ceramic cartridges versus the quartz. And the only difference here is the ceramic or the quartz.
When Jenna was gone through a lot of this data, we have done a bunch of testing and called many different labs, failing many times, or at least they just didn't understand what we were testing for, but they respected and appreciated that we were testing for silica and the differences between the heating elements. They completely understood that. So it's ISO certified and followed FDA testing protocols, and they specialize in vapor analysis. And that's what we were really trying to focus on. A lot of people test for metals, for example. Okay, great. We've always passed those, like when it comes to, mercury or copper or zinc and lead, everyone has to pass those. That makes sense. And that's a big reason why a lot of these labs, exist, to make sure, they pass all these cartridges with oil in them, pass the heavy metal test. But they could do that type of test, but they couldn't do the vapor analysis. That required way more equipment and, expensive equipment. And so that really gave us the basis for our research paper. And also it proved that the other couple labs that were able to get, some silica, just basic silica testing done, it reached the same conclusion. It was about 6 times more silica in the ceramic than the quartz, and that would range. And we honestly were kind of shocked. Like, we didn't, want people to be inhaling this stuff, or, we didn't want this to happen, but we believe that, after 2018, when it comes to the Vapegate crisis, we had to make something that was better in every way. A lot of these, companies were just, manufacturing the cheap, Chinese product where they cut a bunch of corners. It'd be, 30, 40, 50 cent cartridges. They would use materials that, you wouldn't want to use when you're even eating something out of a bowl or consuming something, but you're actually breathing this in. So very important. We're breathing this in, we're inhaling this. And some people who consume cannabis, they take, 20, 30, 40, 50 puffs a day. a big culprit was vitamin E acetate, of course, and but also they claimed that people were using there was heavy metals in some of them, and the degradation of the elements. And they would use silica, they would use cotton, they use ceramic. Quartz wasn't around until we came out with that mixture. They were using all those elements, and I think a lot of the terpenes and cannabinoids, as Jenna was talking about, also had negative reactions to those different various elements. So let's move on to more of the research and dive in a little bit more. What kind of research is already out there now, Jenna?
Well, unfortunately, most of the vaping research that has been published focuses on nicotine. There are very few studies that focus on cannabis, but we'll talk about a few relevant or similar studies. PAX is another popular vaporizer brand who wanted to put their temperature control to the test. For comparison, they picked the same type of ceramic cartridge that we've used in our study. We picked this particular brand for the same reason I believe that other studies picked this cartridge. It is one of the most popular and common cartridges to find at a dispensary, which makes it representative of the market. To sum up the experiment, they tested their battery pod system against the ceramic cartridge on a varied and constant voltage battery. They let the battery time out, which means that you hold the button and you let it run until it stops providing voltage. The varied voltage, it was only 4 seconds, and the constant voltage, it was 8 seconds. In both cases, you can see a temperature spike right after the battery timed out and stopped delivering the voltage. This means that the ceramic cartridge heats longer than what the consumer is delivering through the button. It was also found that the ceramic cartridges are much hotter than what is advertised online. I found a retailer that advertised this ceramic cartridge to have ranges between 200 and 230 degrees Celsius, depending on the voltage. The PAX study determined that the cartridges actually heat between 400 and 650 degrees Celsius, depending on voltage, which is a significant difference between the advertised and reported temperatures. Grossly misleading.
Jenna, that would make sense, and that would add up when it comes to the localized and generalized burning of the ceramic, that it's overheating the cannabis oil. Ergo, you're, tasting that burnt ceramic, which, is the silica and other negative particulars. It's basically like a, ceramic mug where it's insulating the heat, and it's almost getting too hot. It's irradiating that heat, and ceramic acts as it gets extremely hot. When it comes to dabbing or, inhaling a cart, you want the voltage, to spike a little high in the beginning, so you start getting a puff, but you want it to, be lower so you can taste the terpenes and the cannabinoids and the cannabis oil. And if it's too high, you're not going to taste it. You might get a big hit, but a lot of people would prefer to taste the oil itself. It's where we want to go when it comes to these disposables eventually being outlawed, or some cities saying no more disposables. It's going to go that way and go that direction. And we're prepared to, with these products and with our new products, to pivot and to move that direction. Let's talk about the standard, vaping technology. When it comes to, just real quick on our batteries, one of the things that, we are well known for our batteries. Not only is the ceramic or quartz element inside of the cartridge important for vaping and having a quality vaping experience, but also the battery is extremely important. You need the right voltage, like we were talking about. If you spike that voltage up too much, or if the element, like the ceramic heating element, overheats. So not only can you have issues with not tasting the terpenes and the cannabis oil with the ceramic heating element with localized burning and degradation, but also you can have issues with a battery voltage being too high for that cartridge, and the viscosity, what your centipoise is of the oil inside of the cartridge, it could actually burn that oil, and you aren't tasting any, cannabinoids or, terpenes as well. You want to have the right elements in your cartridge, a quality made cartridge, and you also want to have a quality made battery. And we actually came with these two ideas. Vuber did at around the same time, but the Pulse technology, one of the things it does is it spikes high. It recognizes the voltage, first of all, or the ohms and resistance of every cartridge you put on there. And it's 510 threads, so it's not proprietary. And then it recognizes the viscosity of the oil inside of it. The cartridge has ohms and resistance, and the battery will adjust its voltage according to what the resistance is of the cartridge. So it will spike high, let's say to 2.8 volts to start getting a hit and to take a puff in the beginning, and then immediately starts going down 0.2 voltage every second. So if the recommended voltage is 2.2, it will go down to the recommended voltage, stay there, and you'll always get the Goldilocks hit, just the right amount of voltage. There's not many batteries that are smart like that. There's not many batteries that do that. And so not only do we get the cleanest, most effective hit from the cartridge, from the element, but also the smart battery helps you always get that clean and an effective hit. Next topic, wanting to recreate this experiment to pinpoint temperature control, potentially with a doctor that we've worked with in the past, Dr. Wise. We've, drove over there. We were trying to recreate, buy the equipment with her as a partner. Dr. Wise is one of the heads of a lab over here in Washington, and she's also wrote a paper about inhalation and how the lungs and the temperature and how vaping affects our bodies. And we wanted to have her engage into writing a research paper. It would take a year to 2 years to release, but we felt like it was important. And we also wanted to engage into testing. She could do the basic, heavy metals testing and the basic testing when it comes to the silica, for example. But that, we had to partner up with a different lab. And then she also wanted to do testing on the lungs and how large of a hit that you can take with the average lung, what an average pool is, or an average puff off of a vaporizer. Vaporizers and cartridges, disposable pods are one of the fastest growing things in this industry. And she wanted to understand how people inhaled it at the time, they took for the puff, the average lung size and inhalation, and how much your brain was getting or your body was getting, how much of the smoke your lungs and how much smoke you let out when you took a puff. Did you actually inhale it, or did you let out half of that smoke? And so she's really digging down deep, and we talked to her a lot about not just those factors, but many factors. I would love to have Jenna kind of dive into more about our trip with Dr. Wise and our talks with her in this study conducted with Medicine Creek Analytics.
Yeah, Dr. Wise is a part of a team of scientists working at Medicine Creek Analytics in Fife, Washington. They decided to privately fund research to study the effects of metal leaching in cannabis cartridges. They also analyzed the amount of heavy metals found in their samples of aerosol. The study confirmed the presence of heavy metals in vapors, and that these heavy metals were being leached from various components within the cartridge. Even the mouthpiece was becoming leached from the cannabis oil. They weighed out the components before and after being exposed to the cannabis oil and was able to quantitatively estimate the amount of heavy metals that were being taken from each of these components. So that was a really interesting, groundbreaking study, because what they concluded is that cannabis oil is acting like an acid, leaching these metals from the cartridge, but cannabis oil is not classified as acidic. It doesn't have acidic properties. So I think that just opened the door for even more research to be conducted, so we can figure out more about how cannabis is interacting with the cartridge components.
This might come as a surprise. Let's really go back to our study and discuss the results. What major degradants were found, and what did they do exactly?
Yeah, so we're going to discuss the significant findings by discussing the 5 most concentrated HPHCs, or degradants, that were found in the aerosol samples. As we've stated,
and the aerosol samples are from the samples they took can you explain how they took that sample exactly?
Yeah, so they hooked up the cartridge to a smoking machine that was set to ISO puffing topography standards, which is that 3-second inhalation period with the cool down. So they took a puff, cool down, took another puff, cool down, and they did this 10 times to get the amount of samples that they needed, and then they combined these samples into one to run through the GCMS and the various machines that they use there.
And they don't do this on just one, unit versus, like, let's say quartz versus ceramic. They do it on multiple, right? Like, they're pretty rigorous when it comes to their testing. They don't have like a false, negative or...
Yeah, they ran blank samples, calibrated the systems beforehand. They ran the blank sample so they could have something to compare it to, a standard. It was done pretty by the book, and taking the triplicate samples is also very standard in the scientific community to ensure accurate results. So they not only did the samples in triplicate, but they also did another cartridge as well. So there were 2 different quartz and ceramic cartridges being tested in triplicate for each time period, the beginning, middle, and end of the cartridge's life.
And we searched for many labs that didn't have the equipment. These guys did. Can you explain the equipment that these guys had?
Yeah, so it was difficult finding a lab to test for the silica particles because what's needed to do that is a very strong acid. I believe it's sulfuric acid, which is one of the strongest known acids in the science community. So a lot of scientists don't want to work with that chemical because of how dangerous it is. There's a lot of things that can go wrong. So it was difficult finding a lab that had the capability and safety equipment to take on this project.
I want to make sure that everyone hears what you said about the testing. Can you go back and refer to those numbers again?
As we stated earlier, ceramic produces 129% more HPHCs than quartz. Quartz produced a total of 9.3 ppm or parts per million of formaldehyde, while ceramic didn't produce any. Formaldehyde is naturally created from the combustion of fuels, wood, or tobacco as a degradant product and can also be found in embalming solutions, glue, medicines, disinfectants. Exposure should be very limited since it is a known carcinogen. Then to move on, formaldehyde has not been tested as a carcinogen in animals. The long-term effects are still unknown, and no occupational exposure limits have been established by OSHA. This aldehyde is commonly used in the synthesis of plastics, resins, and solvents. The chemical can still irritate the lungs, causing coughing, shortness of breath, and fluid buildup in the lungs. In extreme cases, hospitalization can occur. Our next HPHC is crotonaldehyde, which is treated as a carcinogen because it is highly toxic if inhaled. Quartz produced 13.5 ppm, while ceramic produced 21.4. Its suffocating odor is highly irritating to the nose, throat, lungs, and mucous membranes, which can cause wheezing, coughing, and shortness of breath. This aldehyde is generally created from the combustion of gasoline, wood, or tobacco. OSHA limits the amount of airborne exposure to 2 ppm over an 8-hour work shift. Acetaldehyde was our next HPHC. It was produced in fairly equal amounts, although quartz produced a little more at 16.4, while ceramic produced 14.9.
Go back a little bit. OSHA limits the amount of airborne exposure to 2.0 ppm over an 8-hour work shift, and the amount that was found was 21.4 ppm?
Correct.
Okay, got it. Keep going.
So going back to acetaldehyde, the 16.4 for quartz and 14.9 for ceramic. Acetaldehyde is the natural occurring chemical found in many foods, such as fruit, milk, and cheese, but is also found when burning wood or gas. It has a pleasant, sweet, and fruity aroma. The body actually creates this aldehyde when the liver breaks down alcohol. Some of it ends up in the bloodstream, potentially damaging membranes and scar tissue. Symptoms and risks are similar to that of alcohol. Amnesia, headache, nausea, and increased heart rate can occur. The last HPHC that we'll talk about is acrolein. Overall, it was the most concentrated chemical in our sample set. Ceramic produced an astounding 50.4 ppm, which is significantly more than any of our other values. Acrolein is classified as a poison and carcinogen. It is most commonly used as biocide to kill fungus, plant life, or microorganisms. Inhalation in humans irritates the nose or throat, causing excessive coughing, shortness of breath, inflammation, and fluid buildup, both in the lungs and in the nasal passages. It also causes dizziness, lightheadedness, nausea, headaches, passing out, mutations, and sometimes death. But due to its many hazardous side effects and the potential to cause cancer, there's really no safe level of exposure. Any exposure is considered dangerous.
So this is obviously very serious stuff. We don't want to say that like this, you've been inhaling this, and so you should go to the hospital because you've inhaled poison. Obviously, these are very small amounts, but they're still over OSHA standards. I mean, these would not be a part of like an FDA-approved device. This would not, when it comes to the main components, the silica, I mean, you could get silicosis. Would you have to consume that for many years? Probably. But is it over OSHA standards? Yes. The other main one, as you mentioned, is the acrolein. That doesn't sound like a very, a fun thing to be inhaling. And is it a minimal amount? Sure. But should we be inhaling it, 10 to 50 times a day with our, as we puff on a vape? No. So what would you say besides those two things and just the pure degradation and the actual, the burnt, flavor that you're tasting? Are those the main components there? Or is there one that would jump out? Formaldehyde, obviously, but ceramic and quartz both show a low amount. We're talking standards that, you would pass because they're so low. Is there something else that you would see in there?
This is a great place to bring up that a lot of these chemicals can actually be found in the air that we breathe in very small amounts. So it's not like these are super unnatural chemicals that were created in a lab and they're super dangerous to us if we inhale these amounts. However, I do want to note that a lot of these HPHCs have very foul taste and smell associated to them other than acetaldehyde. And so that, I think, really highlights what people are tasting and what they're describing when they talk about the burnt aftertaste that they're inhaling with cartridges. It's not necessarily the flavor of the oil or whatever terpenes that they're tasting. It's these degradants that they're tasting. It's, the acrolein or crotonaldehyde, those ones that taste really bad. And also the excessive coughing that people have with vaping as well. People say that, they cough out a lung with vaping compared to flower, but really I think what that is all of these HPHCs ending up in the vapor. And since we know these HPHCs causes inflammation of these respiratory systems, I think it's pretty safe to say that a lot of the negative association with vaping can be contributed to the hardware that people are using.
Well, yeah, and if you think about e-cigs, again, this is a topic for cannabis, but when we think about e-cigs and e-juice, the popcorn lungs, I'm sure you've heard about that, but people have issues all the time with these e-cigs or poorly made vapes in general, whether it's cannabis or CBD, they're putting in those vapes, and it's very, honestly, very disconcerting to know that, we, because of the new industry, because of the new segment of the industry, vaping and obviously the cannabis industry, and then the vaping and the e-juice is also a newer industry, last, a little bit over a decade, that these companies and these manufacturers are cutting corners to just profit and get the maximum amount of profit.
I think that's a great leeway into silica testing that was performed at the European lab as well. Since Vuber's atomizer is primarily made of silica, it was of great concern that the quartz cartridge would shed more silicate particles than the ceramic cartridge. But the results were surprising. The total silicate particle count for quartz was 3,178 ppm, while ceramic was 13,644 ppm. More research is needed to determine why this happens, but it's theorized that the bonds found in the nearly pure silica Vuber's quartz is stronger than the bonds associated with the alumina-silica mixture that the ceramic cart uses. The health effects from inhaling large quantities of silicate particles can lead to silicosis and permanent damage. Silicosis is a progressive and debilitating lung disease brought on by the inhalation of silicate particles. It causes scarring of the lung tissues, making it hard to breathe and supply oxygen to the body. Other symptoms include coughing, wheezing, fatigue, and shortness of breath, which can lead to hospitalization. Ceramic ended up producing 4 times the amount of silicate particles than quartz, making the quartz cartridge a safer option for consumers. But I'd like to take this moment to clarify that none of these results are toxic to the consumer unless you were going through an entire cartridge in a short amount of time, like a day. Otherwise, the samples containing 10 puffs didn't pose any immediate danger. However, these HPHCs could very well be the cause of a lot of the respiratory irritation associated with vaping.
Okay, so it's important to remember that our study gives us a snapshot, a glimpse into what people are inhaling into their body. There's still a lot we don't know, but we're hoping to unravel as our research program continues to grow.
I know you were asking about, what's the most concerning thing that this information tells us, but I think one of the most positive things that this information tells us is that smoking weed, vaping weed in itself is not bad for your health. There are actually a lot of doctors out there that talk about the benefits of vaping versus smoking. I think what these results tell us is that it's not weed, it's not the oil, it's the hardware, and it's the reactions happening behind the scenes.
Yeah, that's a good point. I'd like to wrap it up there. That's all for now. Thanks for tuning in to the Safety Meeting.